Welcome back, gang. I hope week one went well for you. And now, without further ado, let's lead into week two. We'll continue our history of illustration, starting with woodcuts, etchings, and lithography, um, up and through the golden age of illustration. So, first, we start off with a slide here of Johann Gutenberg's printing studio. As I mentioned last week in your lecture, Johann Gutenberg was really important because he made it possible for people to reproduce books. More printing could be done. More people had access to the written word. More people had access to images. So, as we look at woodcuts and engravings, there's a couple illustrators who really nailed this. And I'd like you to really pay attention to how they're using their line work to really give form to the characters in their illustrations. While it's not cross-hatching in a sense, they are carving it, engraving it in such a way that it uses the same method that you'll be using with cross-hatching. So the darks and the lights will be built up in the same way. So here where we have a bunch of darks, we have a lot of lines working back and forth and getting closer together. And as we get to lights, less lines until there's absolutely no lines. You see a variation in the length of those lines, so that the haloing around like the angels in the top, that the line work that does that shadow really kind of varies a little bit, and it moves in and moves out. That gives your piece a little bit more movement. It gives it a little bit more value. It really helps to hold the piece together. So this is a work by Albrecht Dürer. Here's another work by Albrecht Dürer. I love this rhinoceros piece, so I have to include it. But you'll notice the different ways that we've used our blacks to indicate different textures. So we have the armor with the little circle pieces. So he's made a one pattern which sort of indicates the armor. We have another pattern that looks kind of like scale or chain linking. For the legs, we have kind of this hairy texture around the chin, and so just using our tools in different fashions in order to create these different textures. So we don't need to rely on color to moving us around. At this time, they didn't have color to move people around the image or show them what they're looking at, but now we have that ability. But it's good to realize that we can really communicate just as well without sometimes. So here's another piece. We see varying textures in there. The sky is just kind of made into that atmospheric bit by just these long lines that are just repeated. It sort of seeps into the background. We have that brick or stucco wall to the left, which is also a very mechanical looking line, but in a different pattern. The drapery, that's the garments, the clothing, is dealt with a little bit more fluidly, but there's still kind of a structure to them. And then we get into kind of the looser trees, the mountain bits get a little bit more airy. There's more space in between the pen marks. And then, the actual clouds themselves are virtually just white space. Here's another one of the Annunciation. The different textures in the wings, the different textures in the drapery. We're looking at a really strong single point perspective here, really nailing down this image and holding it in place. Here's a portrait, I believe, of Christopher Columbus. Anywho, the different texture of the hair versus that texture in the hat. Those lines are almost similar, but just by a slight movement, really continuing that line just a little bit further, getting the lines a little bit closer together in the hat and a little bit thicker. We really get at a couple different textures with almost the same line. Here's a beautiful piece, and this one just gets very atmospheric. We get some lines that are really close together, making almost a pure black. So yeah, just really lovely variation. Then we move on to Gustave Doré. Gustave Doré just was the king of atmosphere. And you'll notice if you look up some images for Dante's Divine Comedy that he did an entire book of the Inferno, and his illustrations are lovely. The image actually on the assignment page is one of his. So just look at the variation in the direction of the lines here, the direction of those white spaces that really give us that atmosphere, and then we get into those bunchier lines that kind of make up the clouds, and then that more solid line down at the bottom that gives us this idea of earth, of land. Here's another very atmospheric one, a little bit shorter strokes. Those rays that kind of work down and throughout. It's difficult to do pieces that look like this. So I mean, if you're trying to crosshatch and make something that looks like one of these engravings, I wouldn't stress out about it too much if it doesn't look right from the start. Here's another piece, and here the lights and the darks are a little bit more intense. The previous pieces, they're a little bit more subtle, but we get that kind of that dynamic composition. We really feel like there's something crazy going on in this piece just because of the strong diagonals that are made by the light of the clouds behind the dark of the land, and then we see that sort of that diagonal repeated down and throughout, making different triangles from the shapes of the body. Like the one guy that has his arms stretched out, he kind of just makes one triangular shape, and then we get that whole mass of bodies to the left, which sort of makes another one. Also in the woodcut vein, we end up looking at a lot of Japanese printmaking. Here's the Hokusai print that everybody's seen. It's on coffee mugs and posters galore. Here's another piece. So if you're really looking into getting into more illustrations through printmaking, some of that Japanese work is really, really good to look at. I believe the second one is actually a Hiroshige piece. So moving on to some etchings. Etching was really big in the illustration world. We were able to get a little bit finer lines, so you see a lot of the 19th century illustrations are etchings. So here we have a few for Moby Dick. I love this piece. There's so much atmosphere to it, and the whale is just kind of seeping through that surface of the water a little bit. Just beautiful stuff. Here is, I believe, an illustration from the Rockwell Kent version of Moby Dick. This is Ahab from that same version. Another Moby Dick piece. So then we move on to lithography, and lithography is really great because we start to get some more subtle feelings. We're using a different process of printing, so we're able to add a little bit of color into it. We're able to add more easily. We're able to add some really nice subtlety into our shading, and we're starting to get into more modern printing. So you've all seen the prints that kind of look like this. You see the very botanical illustrations that look in the same vein too. After we do lithography, we kind of move on into the golden age of illustration. The golden age of illustration, we're talking early 20th century. We're talking heavy on the book illustration, heavy into some advertisements, kind of poking our head into the Jazz Age, those roaring 20s, but really, like the tail end of the 19th century into the early 20th century. And so there's some big names there, Howard Pyle being one of them. Howard Pyle, really, he wrote versions of and illustrated versions of big stories like Robin Hood and King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and he worked both in color and in black and white. here we have a piece from King Arthur, and just really kind of getting a little bit at some of that texture that we saw in like a Dore or a Durer, but really there's a little bit more air to it. We really are forced to pay attention to the action of the piece based on what we've left in negative space, like in the cobblestones down there. There's not much detail. There's not much detail in the buildings behind. We're really kind of forced to pay attention to where those knights are based on that being the rendered area. Um, Here we have a color illustration. That red bit on the ludist's outfit is really bright. It comes to the foreground. Darker colors on the knight and the character sitting behind, maybe a page. And some highlights at the top of the horse, on the top of the arms, and then that dark tree in the background. So we really get this sense of depth. We get a little bit of a sense of dynamism just because, that green atmospheric background with that red cape, and then, the greens and yellows, all these earthy tones down at the bottom in the earth. So really, it feels like a really moody piece. This feels more like a giving an emotion piece than it does giving character. We can't really see these characters' faces. This is more like a cross between the two. We get a little flash of color, and mostly it's just about these line drawings with a little bit of shadow built in for the characters fighting. We really can feel that lunge because that foot is thrust down into the lower right hand corner of the illustration. We're stepping into it. The other character is stepping forward into the center, and we get that like really nice negative shape between the two of them. And the feet really seem exaggerated. The back feet of the two characters seem really exaggerated as they lunge towards each other. Here we get an illustration from Treasure Island. Everything's on that diagonal. You'll notice, we get that dark strip of beach. We get the red in the multiple characters' outfits. It all stretches like from the lower left to the upper right corner. So that all gives us this sense of dynamism in the piece. We're really able to kind of keep in a closed loop these characters because that the character is bent over and looking down at the two other characters. We get the gaze between the two, the one dead character on the ground, and then the other looking up and looking down at that character. So we kind of get this closed loop between the two of them. This piece based more on a silhouette, so we have the one character that seems very much in detail. We can kind of feel her tension. We feel something ominous going on because this fellow is all in silhouette. Again, we get kind of the room a little bit off kilter, so we get some sort of sense of depth, and we get some sense of dynamism to the piece. Second illustrator from the Golden Age I'm going to show you is Edwin Austin Abbey. He's primarily known for some of his really exaggerated patterns and Victorian style stuff. So here we have a black and white version of his. His black and white stuff gets really intense at times, with color illustration. And this one and the next one are both these really long pan illustrations. So you would see these when I mentioned the triptych that you could do for your Inferno and Paradiso, etc. This is a spread. This would cover 2 pages of a book. Same too here. And you can really feel that march because it's in that long horizontal composition. We can really feel them marching forward. We feel the two characters kind of pop out because we have all this repetition with the black outfits, with the red lances behind, and then the two characters that differ are in front. So we get a feeling of that right to left motion, and then the two characters in the front. We wonder what's going on with them. Good composition. This one's more just a figure study. We kind of get a little bit of an idea of the headdress that this woman's wearing and a little bit of what her face looks like. the really dramatic posing of the woman and the more like, I don't know, sinister sort of pose of this friar-looking character. Again, kind of on this like exaggerated diagonal, kind of giving us this idea that there's something crazy going on, something important in the story is going on. Next, we're moving on to J.C. Leyendecker. J.C. Leyendecker is more known for his advertisement illustrations, and really just has these really architectural suits, and we just feel these like really solid characters. We're starting to get into the jazz age when we start to look at J.C. Leyendecker. So we're, if you want to think about it, the greatest example of the jazz age is kind of The Great Gatsby. So if you've read any F. Scott Fitzgerald, you kind of have a sense of what that might be, or if you've seen like the Hudsucker Proxy, the Coen Brothers film. So here we have these two really solid looking characters, really solid looking suits. They really occupy that space even though we don't know what that space is. Same too here. This is a Saturday Evening Post cover, just part of it. You can tell by the blue line. But this woman is just like really architecturally sound in a way. Like her dress is just like these really, really gridded geometric shapes. This fellow too, we have that strong diagonal based on him sitting on this table and his arms holding the book across his knee, and just like all of that is coming from the upper right hand corner down to the lower left hand corner, and it just seems so solid and chunky, really occupying that space. Here's a black and white version, which still pretty heavy on the line work, still feels really solid. In opposition, we get K. Nielsen. K. Nielsen kind of feels a little bit more like an Art Nouveau kind of feel. So we get that some really architectural feeling stuff like in that dress, but also this really organic feeling to the stippling in the background that gives it atmosphere. A little bit of the plant that's kind of moving around her, that organic life form around her. Her hair ends up feeling really organic. Here we have a couple opposing patterns. Rumpelstiltskin feels really, really like organic and evil, and the woman's hair just seems to go on forever, but it's all based against this really strong patterning. Here we get like the pattern created by the various styles of birds and the stars, and then the patterning in the garments, and kind of this like really muted color palette. This one is one of my favorite illustrations in the slideshow, and so you get all this organic material, with the trees and the patterning in the ground, and then the flowers, and in the braids on the horse, but the characters' garments kind of feel really a little solid. The horse's limbs feel solid, and then we get this like Goliath head that just it's so chunky and odd in that setting. Arthur Rackham you might recognize. If any of you had like a mother or a friend who had one of those like fairy calendars that had like the multiple different fairy drawings in them, Arthur Rackham did like a ton of those fairy drawings, so you'll see his work kind of in those all the time. So here we just have a woman breastfeeding in a kind of a bucolic setting. Here's an illustration for Little Red Riding Hood. You see kind of almost that like really intense like line work, like heavy outline work, and it sort of gives it this like odd feeling, because everything feels sort of natural, but then we get that heavy line work, and that kind of makes it like pushes it over the edge towards cartoon almost. The same here. These fairies feel really kind of cartoony, but the atmosphere feels really organic. The actual shapes are really organic. So it's really kind of that funny dichotomy to be working with. Here we have the mermaid. again, with that really strong line work, the water feels really organic and easygoing, and then that little mountain range in the background. We get that like dark to light to dark to light between the water, and then the light top to the water, the dark little bit at the bottom of this iceberg looking thing, then the line of mountains, and then the light at the top of it, a little bit of dark behind it, and then that gradient in the sky, and that just kind of gives it that feeling of depth. We also have that overlapping of the big cliff face in the front, so really feeling that expansive sea with this mermaid. She feels kind of lonely. Then we move on to what is definitively considered to be Jazz Age illustrations. So the first Jazz Age illustration was this illustration on the cover of Life. We get into our characters feeling a little less natural. They feel a little bit more graphic, like graphic designy, like moving the shapes around for the sake of moving the shapes around, not because our bodies really move that way. We start to use space a little bit differently. We're less concerned with pictorial space and more concerned with that graphic element and things looking like they're popping and like they could be on like a neon sign and would work. Utilizing space in a different way. We get this idea that this person is in this space, but at the same time, it's more about the character. It's more about who she is. A good little Halloween piece here, because everybody needs a Halloween piece in January. Makes you feel a little warmer, doesn't it? But really this like strange architectural feel to the composition, the interaction between the donkey head, the elephant head, kind of listing all the way to the left with this character in the middle holding us together. Here we have the Jazz Age is, I think, one of the most notable things about the Jazz Age is the ability to make smoke look like something architectural. So here we have a very loose drawing. We left out a lot of negative space, but we get this sense of where this character is based on her smoke and her forearm and her hair. This piece, we get just a very architectural feel to the dress. We get that really organic flowing feel to the smoke. It really kind of activates that whole space. This character feels elegant based on the way she's holding her arm, that tip to her head, the little flip in her hair across her cheek, just really kind of subtle stuff, but really beautiful. Spot color just in that oranges, in those two oranges, and then a little bit of like a tan or tannish green against that black. All right, so some F. Scott Fitzgerald covers coming up here. So here's a cover to Flappers and Philosophers. This is a little bit more of a naturalistic sort of feel to the Jazz Age. Then we get a little bit more of a cartoony one where, we're really stressing the dress of the times. Here's a very designy feeling for Gatsby. We sort of have to like read into the ideas of the story a bit more. What do we know about this character? Like, how elusive is he? Like, what is this guy? Here we get the eyeglass sort of iconography from the book, along with this one was actually done for a movie poster with the movie version with Robert Redford in it. So you'll notice that the character looks like Robert Redford, but we get that really strong line work against some really strong shape work. The character is really based on these like really gentle lines with some really solid silhouetting, and then the car is made up of that similar style. So, but the car seems a little bit more solid than the man for some reason. And then here we get kind of this like weird new agey cover to The Great Gatsby. So just wanted to throw this one in there to, we're constantly re-envisioning what these works look like, but, they don't always have to be the time period that they came from, basically. So for your second exercise, your first exercise was the was the animal sketches. The second exercise, I would like you to pick one of the classics, one of these three classics, Moby Dick, King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, or The Great Gatsby, and produce a full color cover illustration for the book. You're welcome to use any medium, but please take care that it would reproduce well. So leave some dead space for the title and author name, so you don't want to put anything detailed in your illustration where you would normally have title, etc. Also, that you'll understand that people will be able to see the title and whatnot later. And your exercise will be due on Monday, next Monday. So please, I look forward to seeing what you come up with. Shoot me an email if you have any questions, or send me a text message. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions. Take care. Bye-bye.